There's always something new from our sponsor, Text Control. They just released version 30 of their document processing library that includes new document collaboration features. Using TX Text Control, you can integrate online document editing, document signing, collaboration, and PDF processing into your ASP.NET and ASP.NET Core web applications. Whether you need to create PDF invoices, quotations, or reports, TX Text Control provides the developer libraries for all document-related tasks. Check out the new features and see their technologies in action by visiting the live demo at demos.textcontrol.com. That's demos.textcontrol.com. I'm Scott Hanselman, and it's another episode of Hansel Minutes. Today I'm with Stevenson Jean-Pierre. He's an engineering manager and works in database reliability at PagerDuty. How are you, sir?
Scott, I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm very well. I've enjoyed chatting with you on Twitter, so this is an opportunity for us to move from Twitter Spaces into a formal podcasting environment. And one of the things that you and I were doing was teaching some of the younger and earlier in career folks about how to get into tech. And when I look at your LinkedIn and when I explore the direction that you've gone in tech, you've had a lot of different hats and a lot of different titles. What was your first title?
My first title out of school was system administrator, where I was the backup administrator at a medical transcription technology company. So I was responsible for swapping out the huge tapes to make sure that we had a constant stream of backups for our systems.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that title, systems administrator, was kind of one of those, Jack or Jill of all trades, master of none type of titles? You're a Swiss Army knife. You do whatever needs to be done.
Yeah, for sure. On the ladder, it was a little higher than like IT help desk, but it was like you're responsible for the servers at this place, not just the computer repair. But we definitely did some of the system maintenance and computer repair activities at that place.
Mm-hmm. When do you think that administrator turns into engineer?
I think when there's pre-planning involved, right? So administrator, in my mind, is like you're completely reactive and you're dealing with things that come up with the system. Whereas engineer is when you're pre-planning, you're deciding on designs, you're putting some thought and effort into a solution that you need to provide.
I think that's a really good definition. Like there's an intentionality to it. There's planning. We're going to execute on that plan. A lot more teamwork. When I was doing admin work, I was answering, as you say, help calls. I was kind of Johnny on the spot. I have to jump and do something. Hopefully we avoid those kind of things when we move into engineering and have fewer fire drills.
Yeah, in the SRE world, there's still some reactionality, but you hope that you're spending more time doing engineering work than doing what we call ops work.
Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of buzzwords out there now, and I never know if they are describing a new thing or if they are just giving a label to a better label to a thing that's always existed. Do you think that an SRE, a site reliability engineer, and a DevOps person, is that the same thing? Help me understand these terms.
So SRE being site reliability engineer and DevOps engineer being a title that shouldn't really exist in my mind is an interesting question. So DevOps is a practice, right? And it was all about breaking down silos in software delivery where you don't want software development teams to just throw something to the operations team to get them to deploy. So DevOps try to bridge that gap by making sure that the people that were doing the software delivery were in tune and in touch with the people actually running the systems. And site reliability was the actual kind of role that would be involved in that, be involved with the scaling of a system, be involved with the deployment practices of a system and things like that. But DevOps is a methodology, not a role. And you shouldn't have people titled DevOps engineer in my mind, because that's just, I don't know, it's a weird way to frame it.
Right. And even then you had the title of DevOps, a senior DevOps engineer for a time, a title that you don't want to exist.
Yeah, for sure. And I think back then, the industry as a whole were still finding themselves, right? So we went from being purely system administrators to being software engineers. And then after a while, you're like, oh, these people are focused on delivering software, whether it's from a delivery pipeline perspective or deployment perspective, or just making sure the servers are up and doing what they should be doing. And that was the buzzword at the time. And my old organization decided to use that term. But eventually we started calling ourselves live services, which was a weird way to term it, but they were based out of the UK and that's the term that they liked using. But I think it's equivalent to what some people call production engineers. So there's a few different terms for what we do. It's SRE, it's production engineer, engineers, live services, sometimes DevOps engineer, but at the end of the day, it's all about making sure that systems are up and reliable.
Mm-hmm. And you were around as the software engineering community started to mature. There was a time when we used to just publish directly to production from like someone's desk, right? So it's like, okay, who's going to deploy? Okay, we'll do that from Stevenson's laptop. Did you see that and experience that as we started to mature our build processes?
Yeah, my first real language that I started making money from was actually PHP. So these were LAMP stacks. So if you remember PHP deployment, it was you synchronize with some FTP servers and you're good to go, right? So pushing to production was just an rsync or FTP push away. And as things got more centralized or decentralized from a developer perspective, we needed the ability to make sure that everybody had a common pane of glass to kind of look at and see what was happening with deployments. And we started building out deployment pipelines and other kind of automation around deployment. And it definitely got interesting there because you no longer could just be on your individual machine doing random things because these things had huge consequences.
I used to think, though, that when I would have my little side projects and my little side hustles, that it would be fine for me to just, open up Smart FTP and then just drag my files directly into production. Why do you think that that's a bad idea for even like, an early in career or a one-person software shop?
For a one-person software shop, it's fine, but it's not even fine, right? So part of the maturity that the kind of industry went through is also like maturity and version control, right? You weren't just deploying straight from your machine the last batch of updates that you made. You wanted to make sure that as a team or even as an individual, you had some repository that was holding your code that was accessible. So the idea of pushing became part of the deployment lifecycle. So you weren't just making a change on your local machine and then automatically deploying it to some server resource. You would, push it to your repository, make sure your tests pass. Hopefully you have tests at that point. And then once things pass, you go on to deploy it to your respective systems. So for a one person shop, it's fine. But when you start having folders titled _backup1 and _backup2, it's probably time that you invest in some kind of version control.
See, you're making me feel bad because there were definitely projects that I was doing in the early 2000s and the late 1990s where it was like a project name and then year, month, day .zip. And that was the oh crap button. Where it's like, oh crap, and I need to go and roll back. And it was not mature. But I see people who are starting out in boot camps who aren't starting with Git or they're not doing source control first, and they are still doing zip files. I've even come upon customers of my company that are still not really mature. Now, you're saying that it's okay, but I'm wincing a little bit, and I feel like you're saying it's okay, but you don't really believe it. Are you sure that that's okay for a one-person shop?
Yeah, I think maturity isn't a binary concept, right? You don't just snap your finger and become mature. You have to sometimes experience the problem that makes you realize that there should be a better way to do something. You don't just, I don't, as much as we'd love to learn lessons from others and just kind of cargo cult lessons that everybody else has learned, that's not always the case. And sometimes you have to see true value in something before you adopt it. So when you first lose your hard drive and you lose all your code or something like that, you're like, maybe I should have backed this up to some kind of centralized repository in the cloud or something. So I think those kind of lessons sometimes are hard learned. Sometimes other people have already learned those lessons and they come to your organization. But until you learn some of those lessons, maybe it's not that big of a deal. But hopefully it's nothing important that you're losing when the time comes.
That is really that's one of the things that I struggle with is being someone who's a little bit older in tech. I want them to do it right, but it's an overwhelming amount of information to go from just having your own local source control or having a zip file to an entire DevOps and operational pipeline and site reliability. It's a lot for someone to learn, and the stack itself is already more than I can handle.
Yeah, for sure. But I think modern technology has definitely made software delivery easier. The fact that we have Docker containers now mean that it's no longer shipping a ton of files to get something deployed. It's like I ran it on my local machine with Docker and I could run it in my hosting provider of choice in the same kind of setup. So if people are adopting some of those technologies, it might be easier than what I used to have to deal with, which was copying individual files over, hoping that I had the right deltas and renaming things on remote servers.
Yeah, I recently, just I would say in the last maybe 3 years, finally took my personal website and my blog. And, everyone's got those 12 domains that they never turned into a company. And I've got some static websites and some Gatsby and some Jekyll. And I basically finally got them all set up on on DevOps. Some of them are on Azure DevOps. Some of them are on GitHub Actions. Some of them are on AppVeyor. These are all different systems that'll build and deploy for me. And, it makes me feel like a real boy, like a real company, when you can check some code in and see that it worked, the tests passes, and it went out into production. I think everyone should have that feeling, even if they are a one-person shop.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think GitHub Actions coming onto the scene has probably made CI/CD the most accessible that I've seen in the past decade or so. It used to be you had a CI/CD provider like Travis CI or BuildKite or CodeShip or something like that, and you would have to know that you needed it before you kind of knew that you needed it, right? But now that GitHub has come out with Actions and people are already in GitHub doing these things, it makes it easier to make them curious, right? Like, what is this thing? Because I'm tired of running bash scripts or whatever it is that they're doing to deploy. They now have kind of that curiosity driven kind of motive to kind of learn these things and do it right in the same tool. So I think that's a great thing that's happened. And I think a lot more people will discover CI/CD as a result of that.
Yeah, continuous integration, continuous deployment. It really is a joy. I remember back in the day, we just had a build.bat file. And then we would run that on someone else's server and we declared it the build server. But having that as a service is so powerful.
Honestly, until Ruby on Rails came around, we weren't even testing our code. It was like you write it, you reload the page a bunch of times, it works, you're like, it's good to go. And there was a lot more manual quality assurance happening at a lot of organizations. So you would write your code, somebody would test it, and it would get deployed. But when Ruby on Rails became widely popular, the whole concept of test-driven development and like having spec files and things like that became commonplace. And that's my first foray into like actually testing and then realizing the benefit of having a testing pipeline even before deployment.
Yeah. And I've been exploring browser testing. I've been using Selenium since 2007, but now Playwright and Cypress are out. And the idea that I could write a bunch of tests to have somebody else click on my website after it comes up gives me even more confidence that what I'm deploying is what I mean to deploy.
Yeah, I really love the idea of just doing things that the user would do to discover if things are working correctly or not. And it feels the most natural way to test, right? It's like, here's the behavior that I want the system to have. Let's write the test that'll allow us to mimic a human taking these actions and make it work. Even in the operations space, when I need to ensure that my systems are up and running like they should be, I'd rather run those type of front end tests where it's like, let's go through the user workflows and make sure that things work the way we expect them to.
Yeah. I recently added something to my website. I'm interested in what you think about it. At the very bottom of all of my websites now, I have the runtime version of, I use .NET. So the runtime version of .NET, a link to the actual Git hash of the commit that's live in production right now, as well as a link to the build logs. So I can go confidently everywhere and say, oh, I haven't deployed since February, and that's what's live in production right now. And I think that's just a great best practice.
I think it is too. We thought we were the bee's knees when we started doing that at my last company. It was maybe around 2013, 2014. We had a route that was /version, and it'll just be a little JSON payload that'll tell you the Git hash that you're running, the server. We had to obfuscate the server name so that it wasn't that easy, but we just hashed it with like some part of the time or something like that. So it was dynamic, but we made sure that we understood like which server we're hitting. If we see a particular behavior, we could track it down and make sure that we understood that. Even Reddit does it. I don't know if you ever see the little pie symbol at the bottom right of the Reddit website, but it gives you server information if you're on the right page. And I always thought that was interesting. But as you scale and as you run multiple copies of applications and servers, you find that you need that sort of traceability sometimes just to understand weird behavior that you may see.
Yeah, that's a super great best practice. I have a route on my site /health check. In the old days, it would just return the word healthy, which just told me that HTTP worked. But health check is a great opportunity to go and make sure your database connection strings are good and everything. And then if you're running a farm, like you just said, you can go and have a web API for health for your entire site. It seems so funny that so few of us have thought about that idea. You were doing that 10 plus years ago. That's great.
Yeah, it should be common practice because even having a health check route is how we tell our load balancers that our application is healthy enough to be part of a serving pool, right? So if we would validate database connections, we'd validate maybe cache connections and a few other things, and we'd say this application is healthy and it should be included in your load balancer. So yeah, having a health check route is a best practice too. I wonder if people kind of think about that out the box. I know once you get to a certain scale, you start having to consider those things.
Yeah, I'm only on one server at this point, and I mean, I've got 3 apps all living on one server in different containers, but it just seemed like a great best practice to have a health check route. And then, of course, like you say, it gives you even global health. So I've distributed either with Azure Front Door or with something like Cloudflare. I can see how long it takes, and I can use it as a measurement for my CDN, for my content distribution network, to make sure that all the users worldwide are having a great experience.
Nice. We used to use a platform named Pingdom for that kind of thing, where it's like globally distributed health checks to make sure that the service worked correctly and had the kind of latency profile that we wanted it to have from various regions.
Mm-hmm. Sponsoring today's podcast is Datadog, a cloud-scale monitoring and security platform. Datadog integrates with more than 450 technologies, including Cloud Foundry, Docker, Kubernetes, and Kafka, so you can get deep visibility into every layer of your applications and infrastructure, in the cloud, on-premises, in containers, or wherever they run. With rich dashboards, machine learning-powered alerts, and distributed request tracing, Datadog helps engineering teams resolve issues quickly and release new features faster to market. Start monitoring your dynamic cloud infrastructure today with a 14-day trial. Listeners of this podcast will also get a free t-shirt for trying Datadog. Check it out at datadoghq.com/HanselMinutes. That's datadoghq.com/HanselMinutes. So how do you think, because you and I work in the space of getting new people into tech, how do we get someone from a small project, small portfolio, or a small blog into the level where they can have a conversation like you and I are having?
I think it takes actual practice, right? It takes having to deploy systems and run systems to some level of like scale to make sure that you have these things. So I think when people are, like you mentioned, you're only running one copy of your application. So sometimes you don't even consider what it means to not store state in the application because you have that just individual application running. But as soon as you try to say, I want more than one copy of my application running at the same endpoint, you start having to worry about a lot of those things where all of a sudden you're noticing different behaviors between requests and you realize that you've been keeping some portion of state in memory and things like that, which can affect how your application functions.
That's a great point, because that's systems thinking and that's not really code thinking. Like so many people who are getting involved in tech early in career are thinking about syntax and for loops and algorithms and things like that. But you're really thinking about understanding how something behaves in a system, how round robin load balancing or different load balancing techniques work. So when you're working on big projects like this, big projects that are running across multiple servers, somebody's got to carry the pager. Talk to me about what that means to carry the pager, because you do work at PagerDuty right now, because some of the young people don't know what a pager is.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, if you're running a project or you're running even a personal site that has some benefit to somebody else, right? So you have users, you're going to want to know if you have any sort of operational issue with that platform, whether it's your application going down or your application not doing the thing that you expect it to do in a timely manner. So the idea that you have some system to let you know when something's gone wrong with your platform, instead of you having to go in and check it every 10 minutes to make sure it's still up, you have health checks and you have alerts and you have monitors against your system so that you can track the things that are important to that particular application. And if you find that one of those things are out of bounds or not working as expected, you want to know about it. And you're not always right at your computer to get a Slack message or get just an IM or a direct message. So something like carrying the pager means that your phone will ring or you'll get a message that lets you know wherever you are that something's gone wrong. And there's services out there that do it. PagerDuty being one of them, where it links up with all of your monitoring and alerting, and it makes sure that you know that something's gone wrong. And PagerDuty is very persistent too. So if you don't pick up, it'll continue to escalate until the right person does pick up. So as a one-person shop, you may just be the only one getting the call, but as you become part of an organization, it might be you getting the call, the rest of your team getting the call, then eventually your manager, director, even the CEO, if you have them as part of your escalation chain.
Oh, wow. So it'll like wait 10 minutes and then say, Stevenson's not answering the phone. I'm going to call their boss. And then it's all the way up to the top.
Yeah, for sure. We call them escalation policies, but it's important because as an engineering manager, my team has missed pages for whatever reason, and I've gotten paged about it, and I was able to take care of the issue. And we're all human, right? So sometimes we're not available for whatever reason, and that escalation process is something that's necessary, because what you really don't want is having a full restful night of sleep and then waking up the next morning 10 hours later and realizing that your banking app or something like that has been down all night, right? You want to make sure that you get the right people involved.
Absolutely. I've had times where I've gotten a notification on my phone in the middle of a movie and had to step out of the theater and then go out and use the Azure mobile app to restart the thing and then hope that it stays up while I drive home to figure out how I can actually solve that particular problem.
Sure. And what's important is that you learn lessons from each one of these type of outages so that you're building up not only your own mental model about how your system could fail, but you're taking care of the failure modes as you learn about them so that you're not constantly encountering the same failures over and over again.
That is another fantastic example. I love that you brought that up of systems thinking, right? If it happens twice, you should probably automate it, right?
Yeah, for sure. If it happens twice within a short period of time, okay, that's normal, that's expected. But if you are week to week having the same exact failures and not taking care of the thing that's leading to these failures, then you should step back and kind of consider holistically what are the common patterns that I've seen with failures and what can I do to prevent these from happening. Sometimes it might be as rudimentary as I'm going to restart the service every day at a certain time to make sure that it doesn't run out of memory. But deep down inside, you know you should be chasing what's doing all the extra allocations to cause me to run out of memory in the first place.
So that brings up a thing internally at Microsoft. Sometimes we've called that putting a Band-Aid on cancer, where there's something fundamentally wrong with your app, but you're just rebooting it every little while just to get rid of that error. So explain to me what the relationship is then between an SRE, a site reliability engineer, and then the frontline engineers that are doing that code. Do you call them and say, we've identified an issue, or do you make the fix yourself?
So it actually depends on the model that the company chooses to do. So Google, when they first started their SRE organization, SRE members were embedded on each of the software development teams, and they were seen as part of the team. They happened to be subject matter experts on systems and on like how operations work for systems, but they were just a member of the team. And in that case, that SRE would be fully capable of taking care of the issue it is, whether that requires a code change on the application or some other mechanism to stop the pain. Some other organizations, like my past organization, we had dedicated SR or DevOps teams that were responsible for the liveliness of the application. So if something did go wrong in the middle of the night with the application and we couldn't solve it ourselves, we would page in the software team themselves in order to get more subject matter expertise on the call to figure out what's gone wrong. But we empower our SRE people and our DevOps engineers or production engineers to have enough skill to actually debug application failures and to understand the ways that applications fail so that they can take care of most situations without having to involve too many other people.
Interesting. So then, depending on how you structure your organization, you could set it up such that you could put in a pull request, and maybe one of the engineers could just say, "Yep, looks good. Put it into prod, and we'll figure it out in the morning."
Sure. And even at PagerDuty, we believe in a model called full service ownership. So there's not, the SRE team isn't getting paged about individual service failures, right? So if a software delivery team has a failure in in one of the applications that they provide, if that application goes bad or something, they are the ones getting paged directly. It's not any member of SRE. It's not any member of any kind of reliability team. Reliability teams at that point are responsible for core compute platforms and like methodologies at the organization, but they're not responsible for individual services.
Hmm. Now, we mentioned at the beginning of the conversation that you and I both started out with titles like systems administrator, QA engineer, and then moving our way up to being engineering managers. Right now, you're an engineering manager. I feel sometimes like SRE people are not as respected as maybe they need to be, and I'm curious if you agree. I feel like they're the anesthesiologists of engineering because that anesthesiologist didn't do the surgery, but their job was the consciousness of the patient. But we always give the surgeon all the glory. I'm curious if you think that's a fair analogy.
That's very interesting because I feel like everywhere that I've been, SRE has been held to like a higher standard and regard than even like the software engineers. And
Mm,
maybe it's my own bias that like I've been looking at things through my own bias, but it has been infinitely harder for me to find well qualified SRE people than it has been for me to find purely software engineers.
mm,
You hit on the point around systems thinking and things like that earlier, but I there was a period of time where there was no such thing as a junior SRE. It was always somebody went from being a software developer and learned operations, or somebody went from being a system administrator and learned software engineering and became an SRE person. But at that point, each person in their respective right were already like senior at some discipline within software delivery, and they were able to kind of bring those years of experience with them. And I started seeing junior SRE roles now, but for a long period of time, you had to come from either like a really solid software engineering background or a really solid systems engineering background before you became SRE.
Interesting. So it seems like my analogy might work, but then in this context, the anesthesiologist is really the person that knows the most about what's going on because they have graduated into that lofty role of being able to keep everything reliable.
For sure. And some parts of it, because it was maybe a newer type of responsibility at organizations, it's hard to teach, right? So any role like that that's hard to teach, I found that they're held in higher regards because you can't just pick somebody up off the street and say you're an SRE now and you have all this kind of, it's a lot of pattern matching, for lack of a better term. You have to have the experience to see how things fail to start thinking about things holistically like that.
That is so true. I did a talk recently on mentorship and sponsorship and how we can get more experienced people. And the way you get more experienced people is by giving them experiences, letting them experience those things. Job shadowing an SRE in a modern day cloud environment would be a super fun thing to do. Like I might want to go and job shadow you sometime and learn how that stuff works because it's been a while. I have not been an SRE in a post cloud environment for anything other than my own sites. For me, an SRE would have to go and fix the rack, pull it out, swap out the bad hard drive, and put it back into the rack. So I was a hardware level SRE, and I haven't thought about it in the context of the cloud.
Yeah, and one of the places where SREs differ from system administrators is when machines and compute started being software defined rather than like hardware defined, right? We got to the point where in a cloud, instead of like calling somebody up and saying, I need 40 servers, you were literally issuing API calls and doing a bunch of like orchestration around APIs in order to get those 40 servers. And that's when in my mind, we started crossing that boundary between just being system administrators and being software engineers because we had to glue a lot of those systems together. And with regards to shadowing, every 3 months or so, my team picks up a new intern. And it's always interesting for me to see because one of my measures as an eng manager is like how easy it's to onboard people, right? And having an intern that learned basic software development come into an environment like a site reliability organization and all of a sudden being bombarded by so many high level concepts and topics all at the same time makes you truly realize like how many things people have to fit into their mental models in order to be effective at reliability engineering.
Yeah. I also love that example you gave of pattern matching because, what is the difference between a later in career and an early in career person? The later in career person says, I've seen some stuff. It's that gif of somebody smoking, like, oh, I've seen. So, they had the 1,000-yard stare as they remember the Great War, the great site reliability wars of the early 2000s.
Yeah, there's a great quote. It's like being a senior engineer means that you've broken systems in more ways than a junior engineer could think of. And I love that because it's true. I've dropped tables on databases. I've deleted databases. I've locked ourselves out of all of our Linux systems. I've done so many things to break systems that I immediately can identify when one of those things has happened.
It's important though that you and I both were able to do that though, and haven't been fired yet, right? Because we want people to feel like they can make mistakes, but then the larger community and the system will heal itself. Like I've definitely dropped tables in production. I feel like everyone has that story. I wonder how many people survived and didn't get fired though.
Never in my life seen somebody get fired for any production outage or any bug. I mean,
That's
the
good to know.
company's invested in you. I mean, yeah, I've never seen that happen. And me being an eng manager now, I can't even fathom the idea that I fired somebody because they had an error in something,
Mm.
right? You got to think about failures in systemic ways. Failures don't happen in isolated fashion. So if my deployment pipeline allowed me to do something catastrophic, then yeah, we need to think about what it is about the deployment pipeline that might be at play. If an individual employee decided to go rogue and
Mm.
did something nefarious, what is it about our system that allowed that to happen too, right? Should we have more safeguards? Are these things important enough that we do gate them behind 2 or 3 levels of approval before they actually take place? So I don't believe that you could just get rid of an individual and solve a problem.
That is the sign of a healthy organization. I think you can agree that you could see why an early in career person might be afraid that they might be in trouble.
Oh,
But
for
you're
sure.
absolutely right. It is the system that failed them and not a personal failure.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, yeah, there's always that feeling of yeah, when you break something, you have that feeling of guilt, even if it's truly not your fault or something. You feel like it was a lapse of judgment or a
Mhm.
mistake. But we've all been there, and I think as an industry, we need to share those failures a lot more than we share just the success. Because I'm probably full of more failures than I am success, but it makes the success that much better when you know the different ways things fail.
Absolutely the same. I've got some stories of so many things, and and I appreciate. There's one of these great hashtags. I'm sure you've seen Hug Ops, not just DevOps, but Hug Ops. So you send hugs and Hug Ops to our developer, our site reliability engineers when a website goes down. So GitHub will go down, and we could all be mad and shake our fist at the cloud, or we could send Hug Ops because we know somebody's on the pager and just got a note from PagerDuty that something's going down.
Yeah, hug ops are super important. It's not a matter of if, but when your system's going to go down, right? So don't be like, honestly, don't be on Twitter just like being mean to people because their systems are down. Because if you run anything with customers, at some point it'll go down. I guarantee it, whether it's intentional or not, it'll go down. So just be mindful of the humans on the other end of the equation and how bad they might already be feeling. I've definitely doom scrolled during one of our outages before, trying to see if people are mentioning, my particular software while it's been down. And it's always lovely to see the hug ops rather than just people complaining about the fact that we're down.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much, Stevenson Jean-Pierre, for chatting with me today.
Thank you for having me.
You can check out SJP on Twitter at twitter.com/SJP1804. I'll put links to that in the show notes. And this has been another episode of Hansel Minutes. We'll see you again next week.